much, and thank you, Penny, and very glad to be here tonight. I'm going to start by, I'm going to read two poems about dogs to start with. Just start kind of simply, and then we'll go on to more complicated creatures later, like cats, for example. So I'm going to read, the first poem is about I'm going to just add some moral salt to this. The first poem is about a bad dog, and the second poem is about a good dog. And as far as autobiographical interest, the bad dog belongs to the neighbor, and the good dog is my dog. So this is the poem about the bad dog, and it's called Another Reason Why I Don't Keep a Gun in the House. The neighbor's dog will not stop barking. He is barking the same high, rhythmic bark that he barks every time they leave the house. They must switch him on their way out. The neighbor's dog will not stop barking. I close all the windows in the house and put on a Beethoven symphony full blast, but I can still hear him muffled under the music, barking, barking, barking. And now I can see him sitting in the orchestra, his head raised confidently as if Beethoven had included a part for barking dog. When the record finally ends, he is still barking, sitting there in the oboe section barking, his eyes fixed on the conductor who is entreating him with his baton, while the other musicians listen in respectful silence to the famous barking dog solo, that endless coda that first established Beethoven as an innovative genius. This is my dog, and the poem is called Dharma. It's not the dog's name, I assure you. But Dharma, I believe, would mean something like your spiritual essence or spiritual destiny. And so this is about my dog, Dharma. The way the dog trots out the front door every morning, without a hat or an umbrella, without any money or the keys to her doghouse, never fails to fill the saucer of my heart with milky admiration. Who provides a finer example of a life without encumbrance? Thoreau in his curtainless hut with a single plate, a single spoon, Gandhi with his staff and his knotted diapers. Off she goes into the material world with nothing but her brown coat and her modest blue collar, following only her wet nose, the twin portals of her steady breathing, followed only by the plume of her tail. If only she did not shove the cat aside every morning and eat all its food. What a model of self-containment she would be. What a paragon of earthly detachment. If only she were not so eager for a rub behind the ears, so acrobatic in her welcomes. If only I were not her God. This is a poem called Velocity. In the club car that morning, I had my notebook open on my lap and my pen on cap, looking every inch the writer, right down to the little writer's frown on my face. But there was nothing to write about except life and death and the low warning sound of the train whistle. I did not want to write about the scenery that was flashing past. Cows spread over a pasture, hay rolled up meticulously, things you see once and will never see again. But I kept my pen moving by drawing, over and over again, the face of a motorcyclist in profile, for no reason I can think of, a biker with sunglasses and a weak chin, leaning forward, helmetless, his long, thin hair trailing behind him in the wind. I also drew many lines to indicate speed, to show the air becoming visible as it broke over the biker's face, the way it was breaking over the face of the locomotive that was pulling me toward Omaha and whatever lay beyond Omaha for me and all the other stops to make before the time would arrive to stop for good. We must always look at things from the point of view of eternity, the college theologians used to insist, from which I imagine we would all appear to have speed lines trailing behind us as we rush along the road of the world, as we rush down the long tunnel of time. The biker, of course, drunk on the wind, but also the man reading by a fire, speed lines coming off his shoulders and his book, and the woman standing on a beach, studying the curve of horizon, even the child asleep on a summer night, speed lines flying from the posters of her bed, from the white tips of the pillowcases, even from the edges of her perfectly motionless body. Spoil me. This is a poem it's about getting a song stuck in your head. And there seems to be a kind of a ratio that the worse the song, the more adhesive power it has to adhere to the mind. Some folk remedies have been suggested for clearing up this malady. One is that if you can blow out a bad song by playing a good song over and over. But I find that the bad song just gets more tenacious out of a kind of resentment, and it backfires. At any rate, that's the subject of the poem, and the title is More Than a Woman. More than a woman. Ever since I woke up today, a song has been playing uncontrollably in my head, a tape looping over the spools of the brain, a rosary in the hands of a frenetic nun, mad fan belt of a tune. It must have escaped from the radio last night on the drive home and tunneled while I slept from my ears to the center of my cortex. It is a song so cloying and vapid, I won't even bother mentioning the title. But on it plays as if I were a turntable covered with dancing children and their spooky pantomimes, as if everything I had ever learned was slowly being replaced by its slinky chords and the puffballs of its lyrics. It played while I watered the plant, and continued when I brought in the mail and fanned out the letters on a table. It repeated itself when I took a walk and watched from a bridge brown leaves floating in the channels of a current. In the late afternoon it seemed to fade, but I heard it again at the restaurant when I peered in at the lobsters lying on the bottom of an illuminated tank which was filled to the brim with their copious tears. And now at this dark window in the middle of the night, I am beginning to think I could be listening to the music of the spheres, the sound no one ever hears because it has always been playing. Only the spheres are colored pool balls, and the music is coming from a jukebox whose lights I can just make out through the clouds. This poem is about a friend of mine who, he lives, I met him in college, he lives in Vermont, still lives in Vermont, and I live sort of in and around New York, and we used to visit each other on weekends sometimes, and so I'd go up to the country and he'd teach me about country life, about like hunting and fishing and hiking and things, and then he'd come down to the city and I'd teach him about city living, like things like smoking and drinking primarily. But in this way we kind of educated each other. And this poem is about a bit of country lore that he tried to teach me that I had a difficult time comprehending. And the poem is just called The Country. I wondered about you when you told me never to leave a box of wooden strike anywhere matches lying around the house, because the mice might get into them and start a fire. But your face was absolutely straight when you twisted the lid down on the round tin where the matches, you said, are always stowed. Who could sleep that night? Who could whisk away the thought of the one unlikely mouse padding along a cold water pipe behind the floral wallpaper, gripping a single wooden match between the needles of his teeth? Who could not see him rounding a corner, the blue tip scratching against a rough-hewn beam, the sudden flare, and the creature, for one bright, shining moment, suddenly thrust ahead of his time, now a fire starter, now a torch-bearer in a forgotten ritual, little brown druid illuminating some ancient night? Who could fail to notice, lit up in the blazing insulation, the tiny looks of wonderment on the faces of his fellow mice, one-time inhabitants of what once was your house in the country? This is a very tiny poem, a short poem called Surprise, and it's about something you hear on the radio often. It's kind of on music programs or wherever, NPR. They just mention this kind of information comes in kind of on a daily basis usually. So I just snagged that and tried to make a little something of it. And the poem is called Surprise. This, according to the voice on the radio, the host of a classical music program, no less, this is the birthday of Vivaldi. He would be 325 years old today, quite bent over, I would imagine, and not able to see much through his watery eyes. Surely he would be deaf by now, the clothes flaking off him, hair pitiably sparse. But we would throw a party for him anyway, a surprise party, where everyone would hide behind the furniture to listen for the tap of his cane on the pavement and the sound of his dry, persistent cough. I should read something serious from here. Can't find anything here. We were talking this afternoon about how there's really no such thing as an original poet, and poets tend to cobble their influences together to make a kind of monster that maybe looks a little original, but is really made up of spare parts from other poets. And this poem I'm about to read actually just steals the first two lines of another poet. And I don't know who this man is. His name is Jacques Criquillon. I found his, one of these days I'm going to run into his older brother and pay for this, but I just found his poem in a magazine, and the contributor's note simply said that Jacques Criquillon lives in Belgium. So I thought that was sufficiently far away so I could have my way with his poem. So I credit him in an epigraph, and then his two lines, the first two lines of this poem are, "You are the bread and the knife, the crystal goblet and the wine." It's a love poem, and then I just restart his poem, and I call my poem Litany. You are the bread and the knife, the crystal goblet and the wine. You are the dew on the morning grass and the burning wheel of the sun. You are the white apron of the baker and the marsh birds suddenly in flight. However, you are not the wind in the orchard, the plums on the counter or the house of cards, and you are certainly not the pine-scented air. There is no way you are the pine-scented air. It is possible that you are the fish under the bridge, maybe even the pigeon on the general's head, but you are not even close to being the field of cornflowers at dusk. And a quick look in the mirror will show that you are neither the boots in the corner nor the boat asleep in its boathouse. It might interest you to know, speaking of the plentiful imagery of the world, that I am the sound of rain on the roof. I also happen to be the shooting star, the evening paper blowing down an alley, and the basket of chestnuts on the kitchen table. I am also the moon in the trees and the blind woman's teacup. But don't worry, I am not the bread and the knife. You are still the bread and the knife. You will always be the bread and the knife. Not to mention the crystal goblet and somehow the wine. This is another very, very small poem. It's called No Time. No Time. In a rush this weekday morning, I tap the horn as I speed past the cemetery where my parents are buried side by side under a smooth slab of granite. Then, all day long, I think of him rising up to give me that look of knowing disapproval while my mother calmly tells him to lie back down. This is a poem for my wife, I'd say. I mean, she had some of you know she had a hand in redesigning this elegant new library you have, and she made many trips down here to Agnes Irwin, and I kept hearing about the school, and so I was particularly eager to visit. And the poem is called 9 Horses. For my birthday, my wife gave me 9 horse heads, ghostly photographs on squares of black marble, 9 squares set in one large square, a thing so heavy that the artist himself dropped in to hang it from a wood beam above a white stone wall. Pale heads of horses in profile, as if a flash cube had caught them walking in the night. Pale horse heads that overlook my reading in this chair, the eyes so hollow they must be weeping, the mouths so agape they could be dead, the photographer standing over them on a floor of straw, his black car parked by the stable door. 9 white horses, or 1 horse the camera has multiplied by 9. It hardly matters, such sadness is gathered here in their long white faces, so far from the pasture, from the cube of sugar, the face of St. Bartholomew, the face of St. Agnes. Odd team of horses, pulling nothing. Look down on these daily proceedings. Look down upon this table and these glasses, the furled napkins, the evening wedding of the knife and fork. Look down like a 9-headed God and give us a sign of your displeasure or your gentle forbearance, so that we may rejoice in the error of our ways. Look down on this ring of candles flickering under your pale heads. Let your suffering eyes and your anonymous deaths be the bridle that keeps us from straying from one another, be the cinch that fastens us to the belly of each day as it gallops away, hooves sparking into the night. Have you had a snow day this year? Probably not, right? No, they groaned, and the chances of having one are becoming less likely. But I'll read this poem kind of in memory of what we used to know as the snow day. And you know what happens? There's it snows, okay, and then there's a kind of tipping point where some authority figure, like the Wizard of Oz, declares it a snow day. And then it has all kinds of legal ramifications. So, snow day. Today we woke up to a revolution of snow. Its white flag waving over everything, the landscape vanished, not a single creature to punctuate the blankness. And beyond these windows, the government buildings smothered, schools and libraries buried, the post office lost under the noiseless drift, the paths of trains softly blocked, the world fallen under this falling. In a while, I will put on some boots and step outside like someone walking in water, and the dog will porpoise through the drifts, and I will shake a laden branch, sending a cold shower down on us both. But for now, I am a willing prisoner in this house, a sympathizer with the anarchic cause of snow. I will make a pot of tea and listen to the plastic radio on the counter, as glad as anyone to hear the news that the Kitty Corner School is closed, the Ding Dong School closed, the All Aboard Children's School closed, the Hi-Ho Nursery School closed. Along with, some will be delighted to hear, the Toadstool School, the Little School, Little Sparrows Nursery School, Little Stars Preschool, Peas and Carrots Day School, the Tom Thumb Child Center, all closed, and clap your hands, the Peanuts Play School. So this is where the children hide all day. These are the nests where they letter and draw, where they put on their bright miniature jackets, all darting and climbing and sliding, all but the few girls whispering by the fence. And now I am listening hard in the grandiose silence of the snow, trying to hear what those three girls are plotting, what riot is afoot, which little queen is about to be brought down. You know when you see girls in the playground whispering over by the fence, you know there's some deep conspiratorial business going on. There's usually three, I've noticed. There's usually one is talking to the others, you know, giving them instructions about this revolt, and the two are looking up, and you know, as long as you can see the die is cast early there. And all right, this poem called The Iron Bridge. I don't think it needs any preface. The Iron Bridge. I am standing on a disused iron bridge that was erected in 1902 according to the iron plaque bolted into a beam. The year my mother turned 1. Imagine a mother in her infancy, and she was a Canadian infant at that, one of the great infants of the province of Ontario. But here I am leaning on the rusted railing, looking at the water below, which is flat and reflective this morning, sky blue and streaked with high clouds. And the more I look at the water, which is like a talking picture, the more I think of 1902, when workmen in shirts and caps riveted this iron bridge together across a thin channel joining two lakes, where wildflowers blow along the shore now, and pairs of swans float in the leafy coves. 1902. My mother was so tiny, she could have fit into one of those oval baskets for holding apples, which her mother could have lined with a soft cloth and placed on the kitchen table so she could keep an eye on infant Catherine while she scrubbed potatoes or shelled a bag of peas. The way I am keeping an eye on that cormorant who just broke the glassy surface and is moving away from me in the iron bridge, swiveling his curious head, slipping out to where the sun rakes the water and filters through the trees that crowd the shore. And now he dives, disappears below the surface, and while I wait for him to pop up somewhere, I picture him flying underwater with his strange wings, as I picture you, my tiny mother, who disappeared last year, flying somewhere with your strange wings, your wide eyes and your heavy wet dress, kicking deeper down into a lake with no end, or name some boundless province of water. This is a poem called Sonnet, and I mentioned Petrarch, the Italian, one of the kind of founding fathers of the sonnet, and his, well, for lack of a better word, girlfriend, to whom he addressed all his love poems, and her name was Laura. Sonnet. I just call my poem Sonnet. All we need is 14 lines. Well, 13 now. And after this one, just a dozen to launch a little ship on love's storm-tossed seas, then only 10 more left like rows of beans. How easily it goes, unless you get Elizabethan and insist the iambic bongos must be played, and rhymes positioned at the ends of lines, one for every station of the cross. But hang on here while we make the turn into the final 6, where all will be resolved, where longing and heartache will find an end, where Laura will tell Petrarch to put down his pen, take off those crazy medieval tights, blow out the lights, and come at last to bed. There's no actual lovemaking in the sonnet, so I thought we'd just get them together for a moment. I wrote this poem that I'm going to read now after I wrote an article by Patrick Susskind, and it was called Literary Amnesia, and the article was about Susskind standing in his book-lined study and being hit by a double realization, kind of double epiphany. The first one was that he'd spent a very good part of his adult life consuming the contents of these books, and the second one was that he'd forgotten pretty much everything that he had read. So that's the kind of amnesia that my poem starts with, and the title is Forgetfulness. The name of the author is the first to go, followed obediently by the title, the plot, the heartbreaking conclusion, the entire novel, which suddenly becomes one you have never read, never even heard of. It is as if one by one the memories you used to harbor decided to retire to the southern hemisphere of the brain, to a little fishing village where there are no phones. Long ago, you kissed the names of the 9 muses goodbye, and you watched the quadratic equation pack its bag. And even now, as you memorize the order of the planets, something else is slipping away. A state flower, perhaps, the address of an uncle, the capital of Paraguay. Whatever it is you are struggling to remember, it is not poised on the tip of your tongue, not even lurking in some obscure corner of your spleen. It has floated away down a dark mythological river whose name begins with an L. As far as you can recall, well on your own way to oblivion, where you will join those who have forgotten even how to swim and how to ride a bicycle. No wonder you rise in the middle of the night to look up the date of a battle in a book on war. No wonder the moon in the window seems to have drifted out of a love poem that you used to know by heart.
Nostalgia. Remember the 1340s? We were doing a dance called the catapult. You always wore brown, the color craze of the decade. And I was draped in one of those capes that were popular. the ones with unicorns and pomegranates and needlework. Everyone would pause for beer and onions in the afternoon. And at night, we would play a game called Find the Cow. Everything was hand-lettered then, not like today. Where is the summer of 1572 gone? Brocade and sonnet marathons were the rage. We used to dress up in the flags of rival baronies and conquer one another in cold rooms of stone. Out on the dance floor, we were all doing the struggle, while your sister practiced the Daphne, all alone in her room. We borrowed the jargon of farriers for our slang. These days, language seems transparent, a badly broken code. The 1790s will never come again. Childhood was big. People would take walks to the very tops of hills and write down what they saw in their journals without speaking. Our collars were high, our hats were extremely soft. We would surprise each other with alphabets made of twigs. It was a wonderful time to be alive, or even dead. I am very fond of the period between 1815 and 1821. Europe trembled while we sat still for our portraits. And I would love to return to 1901, if only for a moment, time enough to wind up a music box and do a few dance steps, or shoot me back to 1922 or 1941, or at least let me recapture the serenity of last month when we picked berries together and glided through afternoons in a canoe. Even this morning would be an improvement over the present. I was in the garden then, surrounded by the hum of bees and the Latin names of flowers, watching the early light flash off the slanted windows of the greenhouse and silver the limbs on the rows of dark hemlocks. As usual, I was thinking about the moments of the past, letting my memory rush over them like water rushing over the stones on the bottom of a stream. I was even thinking a little about the future, that place where people are doing a dance we cannot imagine, a dance whose name we can only guess. Thank you very much. And well, I'll read a poem, a title poem of one of the. I'll read this other poem. I've got a lot. I seem to have two themes because I've been asked a lot of questions recently about my poetry, and it's actually made me think about it for the first time in certain analytical ways. I seem to have two themes in my poetry. One is death, and the other is mice. And death is pretty much everyone's theme, but so I'll read this. I'll try to limit the mouse poems, but I'll read this. This is a mouse poem, and it's a poem that tries to have a help. I like poems with long and helpful titles. One of my favorite titles is Thomas Gray's poem, Ode on the Death of a Favorite Cat Drowned in a Tub of Goldfishes, which is enough to get me started already. And one of my favorites is a poem by a poet named Charlotte Smith, who is a contemporary of Wordsworth's, largely forgotten now. But one of her poems is called, I think it's written in something like 1807, on being cautioned against walking on a headland overlooking the sea because it was frequented by a lunatic. Anyway, this tries to be at least that helpful, and the title is I Chop Some Parsley While Listening to Art Blakey's version of Three Blind Mice. And I start wondering how they came to be blind. If it was congenital, they could be brothers and sisters. Then I think of the poor mother brooding over her sightless young triplets. Or was it a common accident? All three caught in a searing explosion, a firework perhaps. If not, if each came to his or her blindness separately, how did they ever manage to find one another? Would it not be difficult for a blind mouse to locate even one fellow mouse with vision let alone 2 other blind ones. And how in their tiny darkness could they possibly have run after a farmer's wife? Or anyone else's wife, for that matter, not to mention why. Just so she could cut off their tails with a carving knife is the cynic's answer. But the thought of them without eyes and now without tails, to trail through the moist grass or slip around the corner of a baseboard, has the cynic who always lounges within me up off his couch and at the window, trying to hide the rising softness that he feels. By now, I am on to dicing an onion, which might account for the wet stinging in my own eyes, though Freddie Hubbard's mournful trumpet on Blue Moon, which happens to be the next cut, cannot be said to be making matters any better.
Thank you. This is a poem about having a trip canceled, a little European vacation that had to be scrubbed, and as a result, the summer was spent more or less hanging around the house in New York somewhere, and I wrote the poem just to console myself about having this trip canceled, and so the poem is called Consolation. How agreeable it is not to be touring Italy this summer, wandering her cities and ascending her torrid hill towns. How much better to cruise these local familiar streets, fully grasping the meaning of every road sign and billboard and all the sudden hand gestures of my compatriots. There are no abbeys here, no crumbling frescoes or famous domes, and there is no need to memorize a succession of kings or tour the dripping corners of a dungeon, no need to stand around a sarcophagus, see Napoleon's little bed on Elba, or view the bones of a saint under glass. How much better to command the simple precinct of home than be dwarfed by pillar, arch, and basilica? Why hide my head in phrase books and wrinkled maps? Why feed scenery into a hungry, one-eyed camera eager to eat the world one monument at a time? Instead of slouching in a cafe, ignorant of the word for ice, I will head down to the coffee shop and to the waitress known as Dot. I will slide into the flow of the morning paper, all language barriers down, rivers of idiom running freely, eggs over easy on the way. And after breakfast, I will not have to find someone willing to photograph me with my arm around the owner. I will not puzzle over the bill or record in a journal what I had to eat and how the sun came in the window. It is enough to climb back into the car as if it were the great car of English itself, and sounding my loud vernacular horn, speed down a road that will never lead to Rome, not even Bologna. This is also, it's a poem for my wife. I did attend a reading once where, I won't tell you the poet, but he stood up there and he said, this poem is for my wife. She's here. I got the sense that if she weren't there, it wouldn't be for her. Anyway, my wife is not here, but this poem is still for her. It's called Osobuco. It takes on the subject of contentment, which is a difficult subject in poetry, since the ties between misery and high art are fast. I think Louise Gluck defined poetry as the creative act as a release of accumulated misery. So that this poem at least takes exception. So it's called Osobuco. You know what Osobuco, It's from the animal, I think, called the veal, like a nocturnal animal. Which, but it is a kind of vegetarian's nightmare. But nonetheless, Osobuco. I love the sound of the bone against the plate and the fortress-like look of it lying before me in a moat of risotto. The meat soft as the leg of an angel who has lived a purely airborne existence. And best of all, the secret marrow, the invaded privacy of the animal prized out with a knife and swallowed down with cold, exhilarating wine. I am swaying now in the hour after dinner, a citizen tilted back on his chair, a creature with a full stomach, something you don't hear much about in poetry, that sanctuary of hunger and deprivation. You know, the driving rain, the boots by the door, small birds searching for berries in winter. But tonight, the lion of contentment has placed a warm, heavy paw on my chest, and I can only close my eyes and listen to the drums of woe throbbing in the distance, and the sound of my wife's laughter on the telephone in the next room, the woman who cooked the savory osobuco, who pointed to show the butcher the one she wanted. She who talks to her faraway friend while I linger here at the table with a hot, companionable cup of tea, feeling like one of the friendly natives, a reliable guide, maybe even the chief's favorite son. Somewhere, a man is crawling up a rocky hillside on bleeding knees and palms, an Irish penitent carrying the stone of the world in his stomach, and elsewhere, people of all nations stare at one another across a long, empty table. But here, the candles give off their warm glow, the same light that Shakespeare and Isaac Walton wrote by, the light that lit and shadowed the faces of history, only now it plays on the blue plates, the crumpled napkins, the cross knife and fork. In a while, one of us will go up to bed, and the other one will follow. Then we will slip below the surface of the night into miles of water, drifting down and down to the dark, soundless bottom, until the weight of dreams pulls us lower still, below the shale and layered rock, beneath the strata of hunger and pleasure, into the broken bones of the earth itself, into the marrow of the only place we know. Thanks. I'll read, thank you so much. I'll read two more poems. One is, as I said, death is everyone's theme, and if you've taken any exposure to poetry, you know that that's what that's sort of what gets us up in the morning. And if you took sort of like the Norton Anthology of Poetry and scissored out all the poems that had to do with mortality, you would be left with the Norton brochure of poetry. And poets tend to write, feel obliged to write a poem about their own mortality when they have a birthday that you can divide by 10. So there exists a kind of subgenre in poetry of poems on the occasion of turning 30 and 40 and so on. And these poems are generally the same. I mean, they're despondent, and there's sometimes the squinting into the future, and there are a number of nervous tics that take place in these poems. And my poem is sort of an attempt to subvert that, I guess. It's called On Turning 10. On Turning 10. The whole idea of it makes me feel like I'm coming down with something. Something worse than any stomach ache or the headaches I get from reading in bad light. A kind of measles of the spirit, mumps of the psyche, disfiguring chickenpox of the soul. You tell me it is too early to be looking back, but that is because you have forgotten the perfect simplicity of being one, and the beautiful complexity introduced by two. but I can lie on my bed and remember every digit. At 4, I was an Arabian wizard. I could make myself invisible by drinking a glass of milk a certain way. At 7, I was a soldier. At 9, a prince. But now I am mostly at the window, watching the late afternoon light. Back then it never fell so solemnly against the side of my treehouse, and my bicycle never leaned against the garage as it does today, all the dark blue speed drained out of it. This is the beginning of sadness, I say to myself as I walk through the universe in my sneakers. It is time to say goodbye to my imaginary friends, time to turn the first big number. It seems only yesterday I used to believe there was nothing under my skin but light. If you cut me, I would shine. But now, when I fall upon the sidewalks of life, I skin my knees. I bleed. I'll read one more poem, and thank you so much for being not only a responsive audience, but a rather massive one, too. We really appreciate the welcome I've received here. I'm in the habit of reading this poem last. It's become kind of a tick with me. I mentioned a singer in it, and his name is Johnny Hartman. Maybe some of you know who he is. He did a famous album with John Coltrane. Died in the 70s. If you don't know who he is, he was a singer of jazz ballads primarily, and a wonderfully moving baritone. And the poem is called Nightclub. You are so beautiful, and I am a fool to be in love with you, is a theme that keeps coming up in songs and poems. There seems to be no room for variation. I have never heard anyone sing, I am so beautiful, and you are a fool to be in love with me. Even though this notion has surely crossed the minds of women and men alike. You are so beautiful, too bad you're a fool is another one you don't hear. Or you are a fool to consider me beautiful. That one you will never hear, guaranteed. For no particular reason this afternoon, I am listening to Johnny Hartman, whose dark voice can curl around the concepts of love, beauty, and foolishness like no one else's can. It feels like smoke curling up from a cigarette someone left burning on a baby grand piano around 3 o'clock in the morning, smoke that billows up into the bright lights, while out there in the darkness, some of the beautiful fools have gathered around little tables to listen, some with their eyes closed, others leaning forward into the music as if it were holding them up, or just twirling the loose ice in a glass, slipping by degrees into a rhythmic dream. Yes, there is all this foolish beauty, born beyond midnight, that has no desire to go home, especially now when everyone in the room is watching the large man with the tenor sax that hangs from his neck like a golden fish. He moves forward to the edge of the stage and hands the instrument down to me and nods that I should play. So I put the mouthpiece to my lips and blow into it with all my living breath. We are all so foolish, my long bebop solo begins by saying, so damn foolish, we have become beautiful without even knowing it. Thank you.